Roy Kessler had owned the manure spreader for 11 years before he ever thought about parking it next to a swimming pool. On the second Tuesday of June, at 4:52 in the afternoon, he backed his 1998 New Holland spreader across the invisible line that separated his half-acre of scrubland from Birchwood Lake Estates' brand-new $340,000 community pool complex, lowered the beaters, and let 11 months of composted horse manure fly in a slow, deliberate arc across the grass 11 feet from the base of a 3-meter diving board that, according to a survey, stamped and sealed 4 days earlier, had no legal right to exist where it stood. Deborah Voss, president of the Birchwood Lake Estates Homeowners Association, was standing on that diving board at the time, filming a promotional video for the HOA's new resident portal. She did not finish the video. What she did instead, according to 3 witnesses and a Ring doorbell camera Roy had mounted specifically for this purpose, was scream, a word that later required the HOA's own attorney to redact it from the incident report, slip on the wet fiberglass, and go into the water fully clothed, phone in hand. By the time the county sheriff's deputy arrived, called not by Debbie Voss, who was still toweling manure residue out of her hair in the clubhouse bathroom, but by an anonymous board member who wanted it on record that she had objected, Roy Kessler was sitting on his own back porch, 71 feet from the property line, drinking a glass of iced tea and reading a letter from the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, confirming that his property carried a valid agricultural exemption dating to 1974, 22 years before Birchwood Lake Estates Homeowners Association had recorded so much as a single covenant. The deputy, a young man named Officer Halloran, who had grown up 2 towns over, and had, by his own admission when he sat down with Roy on the porch steps, never in 4 years on this job written up a manure complaint at a swimming pool, took photos of the spreader, photos of the pool, photos of the survey stakes still standing in the grass, and told Roy plainly that unless the association could show actual property damage or an ordinance violation, there wasn't much of a criminal matter here. There wasn't. What there was, instead, arrived 4 days later by certified mail, a fine, $600, cited under CC&R Section 12.4, Nuisance Conditions, Odor, Noise, and Environmental Disturbance. Roy read it twice, folded it into a paper airplane, and threw it off the same porch where he'd been sitting when the pool went in the water. Drop your city, and tell me, do you live in an HOA? I want to know how many of you are watching from behind enemy lines right now. None of it. Not the manure, not the fine, not Deborah Voss going into 3.5 feet of chlorinated water in front of 40 resort brochure photos she'd hired a drone operator to take, would have happened if the Birchwood Lake Estates Board had returned a single one of Roy Kessler's phone calls 14 months earlier. Birchwood Lake Estates sat on the eastern shore of Cedar Hollow Lake, 40 minutes outside Wausau, Wisconsin. 61 lots, most of them built between 1968 and 1981, as modest 3-season cabins for families who wanted somewhere to fish that wasn't 4 hours away. Roy's cabin at 1417 Birchwood Trail had been his father's before him. Walter Kessler had bought the half-acre lot in 1974 for $6,200, back when the surrounding land was zoned agricultural residential and half the neighbors kept chickens. Roy had inherited it in 2009, retired there full-time in 2019 after 31 years running a CNC lathe at a farm equipment plant in Marshfield, and brought with him 2 aging quarter horses named Duke and Pepper, a llama named Gus that had been his late wife Dorothy's idea, and absolutely no patience for nonsense. The HOA hadn't existed when Walter Kessler bought the lot. It had been formed in 1996, when the original cabin community was subdivided further, and 11 new lakefront lots were carved out and sold to buyers from Milwaukee and Chicago who wanted cabins with heated floors and 3-car garages. The Birchwood Lake Estates Homeowners Association Incorporated was incorporated that year. Its CC&Rs recorded against every lot in the subdivision, including, on paper, Roy's father's, though nobody at the time seemed to notice, or care, that Walter Kessler's deed already carried a recorded agricultural exemption from 1974 that predated the HOA by 2 decades and, under Wisconsin law, could not simply be overridden by a covenant filed 22 years later. For most of those 22 years, it didn't matter. Walter Kessler paid his dues, mowed his lawn, kept his horses in a paddock nobody could see from the road, and the board left him alone. The neighbors changed. The lake houses got bigger. By 2015, half the cabins had been torn down and rebuilt as year-round homes, with docks rated for pontoon boats and landscaping crews that came weekly. Roy watched it happen from his porch and didn't think much of it, until Deborah Voss moved into the lot next to his in 2021, ran for the board 6 months later, on a platform of raising property values to reflect what this community deserves, and won unopposed because nobody else wanted the job. Debbie Voss had a vision for Birchwood Lake Estates, and the vision was a resort. Her husband, Craig, ran a commercial construction outfit 2 counties over, Voss and Kettering Builders, and within 4 months of Debbie's election, the board's monthly newsletter carried a full-page rendering of what it called The Cove, a 2,400-square-foot in-ground pool with a cabana bar, a hot tub, a 3-meter competition diving board, and a covered pavilion for resident wellness events. Total projected cost, $340,000. Funding source, a special assessment of $4,200 per household, to be voted on at the annual meeting, under Article 14, Section 14.2 of the CC&Rs. Roy went to that meeting. It was the first HOA meeting he'd attended in 9 years, and he only went because the assessment notice had arrived with a due date and no explanation of what a resident who couldn't afford $4,000 was supposed to do about it. He remembered sitting near the back of the clubhouse, in a folding chair that wobbled on the tile floor, next to a woman he didn't recognize who kept whispering to her husband about, finally, a real amenity around here. 41 lots were represented that night, in person or by proxy, out of 61, a number that would matter a great deal later, when it came out that the bylaws required a 2/3 quorum of all 61 lots, not a 2/3 majority of whoever showed up, to approve a special assessment of that size. Nobody checked the math that night. Debbie Voss ran the meeting from a podium with a laser pointer and a slideshow, called the pool an investment every one of us will thank ourselves for, and when Roy raised his hand to ask where, precisely, on 61 lots that averaged half an acre apiece, a 2,400-square-foot pool complex was supposed to fit without encroaching on somebody's land, she told him the engineering had already been finalized and moved to the vote. "Mr. Kessler," she'd said, not unkindly, in the tone of someone humoring a man who didn't understand what he was looking at. The site plan was reviewed by a licensed engineer. I promise you, nobody's backyard is disappearing. The vote passed, 39-2, with 2 lots, Roy's and his neighbor Arlene Petrosky's, recorded as opposed. Arlene, a widow in her 70s who'd lived at Birchwood since 1988, had voted no on the grounds that she was on a fixed income and $4,200 might as well have been $40,000. Roy had voted no because the math on the site plan had never sat right with him, though at the time he couldn't have said exactly why. Ground broke 11 weeks later. Roy noticed the survey stakes on a Thursday morning in April, while he was feeding the horses. They were pink, tied with orange ribbon, and they ran in a line that cut across the northeast corner of his property, roughly 9 to 11 feet past what he'd always understood to be his boundary, the boundary his father had shown him as a boy, marked by an old iron pin sunk in 1974 and a row of lilac bushes Walter Kessler had planted the same year, specifically because, as he'd told Roy more than once, a fence starts fights, but nobody argues with a lilac bush that's been there longer than they have. Roy called the HOA's management company that afternoon. He was told the pool's footprint had been engineered to association specifications, and that any boundary concerns should be directed to the board in writing. He wrote. Nobody wrote back. He called again in May, after concrete forms went up that put the pool deck's edge close enough to his lilac bushes that a crew member trimmed 6 of them without asking. He was told, this time by Debbie Voss herself, over the phone, that the association has an easement for recreational amenities that covers that section. Roy, it's in the original plat. You can look it up yourself if you don't believe me. He looked it up himself. There was no such easement recorded against his parcel. There was, in the county recorder's office, a 2003 amendment to the HOA's plat that purported to grant the association a non-exclusive recreational easement across the rear 10 feet of several lots for the purpose of shared trail and amenity access. But the amendment had been recorded by the board at the time without a vote of the membership, without notice to affected owners, and, critically, without Walter Kessler's signature, which Wisconsin law required for any instrument that burdened his specific parcel. Roy didn't know all of that yet in May. He just knew what his father had told him about the lilac bushes, and he knew a construction crew had cut 6 of them down for a swimming pool he'd voted against. Now that you know Roy, has your HOA ever pulled something that made your blood boil? Tell me the worst thing your HOA has ever done. By the 4th of July, the pool was framed, plumbed, and being tiled. Roy hired a licensed surveyor out of his own pocket, Delbert Owens, PLS, a man who'd been surveying property lines in Marathon County for 34 years and had, as it happened, surveyed half the original Birchwood lots back in the 1970s under a different firm. Owens spent a full day on site, with a total station and a stack of recorded plats, checking benchmarks against the county's GIS overlays twice before he'd commit to anything in writing. I don't like surprising people, he told Roy over coffee at the end of the day, so I checked it 3 times before I called you. On July 19th, he delivered a sealed survey that confirmed what Roy already suspected in his gut. The pool's northeast corner, including the base of the diving board platform and roughly 4 feet of the surrounding concrete deck, sat 11 feet, 3 inches, inside Roy Kessler's recorded property line. The 2003 Recreational Easement Amendment, Owens noted in a footnote, appeared to have been recorded without the required chain of individual owner consents, and in any event could not lawfully extend onto a parcel, like Roy's, carrying a prior recorded agricultural use exemption that predated the HOA's formation entirely. Roy brought the survey to the board's August meeting. He laid it on the table in front of Deborah Voss, Treasurer Marcus Byrne, Secretary Colleen Ferraro, and the 2 other board members, a quiet retiree named Phil Ostrander, who mostly nodded along with whatever Debbie said, and a newer member, Gina Alcaraz, who Roy noticed studied the survey longer than anyone else at the table, and asked, politely, for a written explanation of how a $340,000 pool had ended up 11 feet inside his property, and what the association intended to do about it. Debbie Voss picked up the survey, glanced at it for perhaps 4 seconds, and set it back down. Our engineer's plans show the pool entirely within association common area, she said. I'm not sure what you're asking us to do with a document from your own surveyor, Roy. I'm asking you to hire your own and compare notes, Roy said. If mine's wrong, I'll eat the cost. If it's not, you've got a problem. Marcus Byrne, the treasurer, said the board would take it under advisement. Gina Alcaraz asked, to the visible irritation of the woman next to her, whether the board had commissioned a boundary survey before construction began. Nobody answered her directly. The meeting moved to new business. What the association intended to do, it turned out, was fine him. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from the HOA's attorney, citing Section 9.1, Architectural Review, and accusing Roy of obstructing association improvements through unauthorized survey activity, for having Owens on site without prior board approval, a requirement that existed nowhere in the actual CC&Rs, and that the attorney, when Roy called to ask, could not point to in writing, either. The letter came with a $250 fine attached pending review. Roy paid it under written protest, kept a copy of the check, and kept the letter. The pool opened over Labor Day weekend with a ribbon cutting, a hired DJ, and a banner that read, "Welcome to the Cove, Birchwood's new backyard." Debbie Voss cut the ribbon in a swimsuit and heels. The diving board, 3 meters up, cast a shadow across the last 4 surviving lilac bushes on Roy Kessler's side of the line. Roy did not attend the ribbon cutting. He spent that Saturday afternoon on the phone with the Marathon County Register of Deeds, requesting certified copies of every recorded document touching his parcel since 1974, and with a Wausau attorney named Priya Nair, whom he'd found through a Farm Bureau referral, describing what he had and asking what, if anything, he could actually do about 11 feet of somebody else's swimming pool sitting on his land. Priya Nair's answer, delivered over coffee in her small Wausau office 3 weeks later, was more encouraging than Roy expected, and considerably more complicated than he'd hoped. Yes, the survey was solid. Del Owens's reputation alone would carry weight in front of any judge in the county, and his sealed findings, cross-checked against the original 1974 plat and the county's own GIS records, left little room for the HOA to argue the line sat anywhere other than where Roy said it did. Yes, the 2003 easement amendment was almost certainly invalid as applied to his lot, both because it lacked his father's signature and because it attempted to burden a parcel that already carried a protected agricultural exemption under Wisconsin Statute 9144, the state's agricultural preservation provision, which barred local associations from imposing restrictions that would functionally eliminate an existing lawful agricultural use. And yes, the association's board had very likely breached its fiduciary duty to the membership, first by approving a $340,000 project without confirming the quorum required under its own bylaws, and second, by pushing that project forward on a footprint that encroached on a homeowner's land without so much as a boundary survey beforehand, which any competent board would have commissioned before breaking ground. "Here's what I want you to understand before we go any further," Nair said, sliding a legal pad across the table with a rough timeline already sketched on it. "Being right isn't the hard part here. You're right. The hard part is that being right costs money, and boards like this one are very good at making it cost more money than most people are willing to spend to prove a point. The complication was time and money. An encroachment and easement dispute of this size," Nair explained, "would likely require a formal survey challenge, a quiet title action to resolve the disputed boundary, and if the board refused to cooperate, which every signal so far suggested it would, a breach of fiduciary duty claim against the individual board members, plus possibly a derivative claim on behalf of the membership over how the special assessment vote had been conducted in the first place. Realistic timeline: 8 months to 2 years. Realistic cost, even at a reduced rate Nair was willing to offer given the strength of the survey. Somewhere between $15,000 and $40,000, depending on how hard the association's insurer chose to fight. Roy went home and sat with that number for 2 days. He thought about his father, who'd never once in 50 years had a dispute with a neighbor he couldn't settle over a fence line and a handshake, and he thought about Debbie Voss picking up Del Owens's survey and setting it back down after 4 seconds like it was a grocery store flyer. Then he called Nair back and told her to send a demand letter, the cheapest possible first step, and in the meantime, he had an idea of his own that didn't require a filing fee. The demand letter went out on September 30th, addressed to the board and copied to the HOA's insurance carrier and management company. It laid out Owens's survey findings, cited the defective 2003 easement, invoked the agricultural exemption, and demanded the association either relocate the encroaching portion of the pool complex at its own expense within 90 days, or negotiate a purchase of an easement from Roy at fair market value, an offer generous enough, Nair noted, to make clear Roy wasn't trying to be difficult, just fairly compensated for 11 feet of his own land. The board's response, delivered 11 days later through council, denied any encroachment, reasserted the validity of the 2003 amendment, and, in a paragraph Roy read 3 times to make sure he wasn't misunderstanding it, suggested that if Mr. Kessler continued to pursue disruptive claims that jeopardize a completed capital improvement enjoyed by the entire community, the association would have no choice but to evaluate all available remedies under its governing documents, including enforcement action regarding the ongoing agricultural use of his property, which several residents have raised concerns about relative to community aesthetic standards. It was, Roy understood immediately, a threat. Fix the horses, the llama, the whole business his father had kept lawfully for 50 years, or we'll make your life difficult about the pool. He'd been keeping his agricultural operation exactly as his father had. 2 horses, a llama, a modest composting setup for the manure, all of it well within the footprint his exemption protected, and none of it, by any reasonable measure, a nuisance to anyone. But he had also, in the weeks since Owens's survey came back, been doing some reading of his own, county ordinances, the state's agricultural preservation statute, and the precise surveyed location of his own property line relative to a certain diving board. The composting setup he'd inherited from his father sat, at the time, roughly 40 feet from the boundary, tucked behind the barn, upwind of nearly everything. There was no rule, agricultural exemption or otherwise, that said it had to stay there. $600. Over an odor complaint the board manufactured to punish a man for hiring a surveyor, against Roy Kessler, a 63-year-old retired machinist defending land his own father bought 50 years earlier. Is this legal where you live? What would you have done? The board's letter arrived on October 3rd. The official fine notice, $600, Section 12.4, maintenance of conditions likely to produce offensive odor within proximity to shared amenities, arrived on October 21st, 4 days after Roy relocated his composting operation to the northeast corner of his property, 11 feet, 3 inches from a survey stake, directly downwind, on the prevailing westerly, of a diving board that legally had no business being where it stood. He did not do it quietly. He rented a small excavator for a Saturday, dug a proper lined pit 16 feet by 10, engineered. He was, after all, a machinist, and he did nothing without a plan, with enough slope and drainage to be entirely compliant with the state's agricultural runoff standards, which he had, notably, called the Marathon County Extension Office to confirm before he broke ground. He filed for and received, within a week, a farm operation registration update reflecting the new manure management location, a document that existed specifically so that if anyone from the county or the HOA ever came asking, there would be a piece of paper with an official seal on it saying Roy Kessler had done everything by the book. Then, he waited for pool season. In the meantime, the fines kept coming, and Roy kept paying every one of them under written protest, in checks memoed, paid under protest, disputed fine, see attorney correspondence, because Priya Nair had told him that was the surest way to preserve his right to claw the money back later, without giving the association any argument that he'd waived his objection. By November, the total stood at $2,150 across 5 separate citations, one for excessive equine noise during quiet hours, one for a hay bale visible from the community walking path, one for the composting pit itself under a new provision Roy had never seen invoked before, and 2 more that were, functionally, restatements of the first 3 with different section numbers attached, as though the board's attorney were simply cycling through the CC&R index looking for something that would stick. What the board did not anticipate, and what Roy had counted on, was that the HOA's own management company would eventually have to explain, in writing, exactly what statutory authority it believed it had to fine a 50-year agricultural operation for existing. When Roy's attorney formally requested the board produce the specific ordinance or covenant provision authorizing enforcement against a use protected under Wisconsin Statute 91.44, the management company's response, 3 sentences, unsigned by counsel, cited community aesthetic standards under the association's general nuisance authority, which was, as Nair pointed out with some satisfaction, not a legal authority at all. It was a vibe. Roy filed that response away. He also, in December, submitted his first records request under the association's own governing documents, invoking the members' right under the Wisconsin Non-Stock Corporation Law, which governed HOAs organized as non-profit corporations, as Birchwood Lake Estates was, to inspect board minutes, financial records, and contracts. He wanted, specifically, the bid documents and contractor selection records for the $340,000 pool project. It took the association 6 weeks and a follow-up letter from Nair threatening a court order before the records arrived, incomplete, in a banker's box dropped off at the clubhouse with no cover letter. But incomplete was enough. Buried in the invoices was a contractor named Roy recognized immediately. Voss and Kettering Builders, Debbie Voss's husband's company, listed as the general contractor for the pool project at a bid of $340,000, against 2 other bids in the file, one for $268,000 and one for $291,000, both from established regional pool contractors with public safety records Roy could check online. There was no documentation in the board minutes showing the higher bid had been disclosed to the membership as coming from the board president's own household, nor any record of Deborah Voss recusing herself from the vote to award the contract. Wisconsin nonprofit corporation law required exactly that kind of disclosure and recusal. Whenever a director had a material financial interest in a transaction the board approved. It hadn't happened. Roy sat with that banker's box on his kitchen table for a long time. The pool wasn't just on his land. It had been built on his land, at an inflated price, by the board president's husband, approved by a vote that may not have even met quorum, and now the same board was fining him $600 at a time to keep his mouth shut about it. He called Nair. She used the word derivative claim again, this time with more enthusiasm. Winter gave Roy time to think, and he used it. He went through the banker's box a second and third time, this time with a yellow legal pad, cross-referencing every invoice date against the board meeting minutes to see which expenditures had actually been discussed in a session with quorum recorded, and which had simply appeared in the financial statements as though they'd approved themselves. What he found was a pattern, not just a single lapse. An $18,000 resident portal redesign, approved by email vote among 3 board members with no membership notice at all. A $6,400 wellness pavilion furnishing, line item that turned out to be patio furniture for Debbie Voss's own back deck, billed to the association and never corrected. And the reserve fund, which according to the association's own reserve study commissioned in 2019, should have held approximately $210,000 by the current fiscal year, sitting instead at $149,000. A $61,000 shortfall the treasurer's report attributed vaguely to pool project cost overruns, without ever specifying which overruns, approved by whom, or why the membership hadn't been told. He shared all of it with Priya Nair in January, and she filed the quiet title action the following month, seeking a judicial determination of the true boundary line, based on Del Owens's survey, a declaration that the 2003 easement amendment was void as to Roy's parcel, and an order requiring the association to remove the encroaching portion of the pool complex within a court-set deadline. Filed alongside it, and this was the part that made Debbie Voss's attorney call Nair's office 3 times in one afternoon. was a separate breach of fiduciary duty claim against Voss individually and derivatively against the board, citing the undisclosed contractor relationship, the missing recusal, the disputed quorum on the special assessment vote, and, added as a final count almost as an afterthought, a claim for wrongful assessment of fines issued without lawful authority, seeking return of every dollar Roy had paid under protest with interest. Word of the lawsuit moved through Birchwood Lake Estates faster than the manure smell ever had. Arlene Petrosky, Roy's fellow no vote from the original assessment meeting, showed up at his door within a week with a stack of complaints of her own. A $400 fine for a shed her late husband had built in 1989, grandfathered under the same 1996 covenant transition that should have protected Roy, that the board had suddenly decided to enforce in the same season the pool project needed extra cash. "I paid it because I didn't know I didn't have to," Arlene told him, sitting at his kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug. "Everybody just pays it, Roy. That's the whole trick." Others followed. A young couple on Larkspur Court, Mia and Devin Whitfield, who'd been denied a wheelchair ramp variance for their son Caleb, cited under Section 9.1's architectural standards, despite Federal Fair Housing Act protections requiring reasonable accommodation for a documented disability. A retired Army sergeant named Delroy Watts, 3 lots down from the clubhouse, who'd been fined $175 for flying an American flag on a pole the board decided was 2 feet taller than aesthetic guidelines permit, a fine he'd paid twice out of sheer exhaustion before deciding, watching Roy's fight unfold, that he wasn't paying a third time. Delroy showed up to Roy's place one evening in February with a 6-pack and, before he'd even sat down, said, "I did 2 tours so nobody could tell me what to do in my own front yard, and I let a woman with a laser pointer take my flagpole down without a fight. That's done." By March, 7 homeowners had joined what Nair started calling, informally, the Birchwood File. Not a class action, not yet, but a shared pool of grievances, records requests, and increasingly, at Roy's kitchen table on Thursday evenings, a shared strategy. Gina Alcaraz, the one board member who'd asked the uncomfortable question at the August meeting, quietly resigned from the board in April, rather than keep signing off on financial statements she said she couldn't in good conscience certify, and began showing up to the Thursday meetings herself, bringing internal knowledge of how the board's email votes actually worked, that no records request could have surfaced on its own. They pulled the association's full financial records under a joint request that carried more legal weight than any one homeowner's alone. What came back, slower and more incomplete than before, but eventually complete enough, showed the reserve fund shortfall Roy had already found, the landscaping contract awarded to Marcus Burns' brother-in-law at rates 22% above the 2 competing bids in the file, and board meeting minutes, when they existed at all, that recorded votes with no discussion of conflicts of interest anyone could find. Gina confirmed what the paper trail suggested. Most board votes over the past 2 years had happened over email, 3 signatures at a time, specifically to avoid the kind of open discussion that might have raised questions. Roy just made a critical move, filing suit against the board that fined him, instead of quietly relocating his horses to make them happy. Was that the right call? What's your strategy? Tell me in the comments. Roy took the pile of it to the county's Better Business Bureau chapter, filed a formal complaint with the Wisconsin Department of Financial Institutions regarding the nonprofit corporation's compliance failures, and, on Delroy Watts's suggestion, reached out to a reporter at the Wausau Daily Herald who covered local government and had, as it turned out, done a story 18 months earlier about a different HOA's special assessment fight 2 counties over. The manure pit did its work the following June, on the first genuinely hot weekend of the summer, which was also, unhappily for the board's timing, the weekend Deborah Voss had scheduled a professional drone shoot to promote the pool for the HOA's new marketing push, a resident portal redesign that, Roy would later learn from the same banker's box of records, had cost another $18,000 the board had approved, without putting it to a membership vote at all. The wind that Saturday came steady out of the west at 11 miles an hour, according to the National Weather Service data Roy pulled afterward, not because he needed it for any legal purpose, but because he was, by nature, a man who liked things documented. It carried the smell of 6 weeks of properly composting, entirely lawful, agriculturally exempt horse manure, directly across a pool deck that had, by any honest measure, been built on his side of the line to begin with. The drone operator, a college kid named Tyler hired through a marketing agency in Wausau, later told Priscilla Ames off the record that he'd had to reshoot the aerial pass 4 times because the pool crowd kept visibly recoiling in every take. By the time the fine notice for that Saturday arrived, $600 again, Section 12.4, plus a new citation under a section of the covenants Roy had never seen invoked before. Conduct unbecoming a community member, engaged in retaliatory fashion against the association's improvements. Nair had already filed the quiet title action, and the reporter, Priscilla Ames, was already 3 weeks into her own research on the Birchwood story. Ames came out to Birchwood in September. She photographed the diving board, from a respectful distance, and after the smell, mercifully, had faded with the season, photographed Roy's survey stakes, and interviewed 6 of the 7 homeowners in the file. She sat with Arlene Petrosky for over an hour, and with Delroy Watts on his porch under the same flagpole the board had once measured with a tape from the street. She also called Deborah Voss for comment. Voss did not return 3 calls. The HOA's attorney eventually issued a 2-sentence statement calling the dispute a private matter under active litigation that the association intends to resolve appropriately, which Ames printed in full, directly above a photograph of the pool's diving board with Roy's 4 surviving lilac bushes visible in the frame. The story ran on a Sunday, above the fold in the print edition, and, more consequentially, shared 4,200 times on the paper's Facebook page within 48 hours. Most of the comments, some variant of the word unbelievable, and a smaller but vocal contingent specifically demanding to know whether Roy Kessler would consider running for the board himself. He hadn't planned to. Priya Nair suggested it might strengthen his position going into mediation. Delroy Watts and Arlene Petrosky suggested it because, as Arlene put it at Roy's kitchen table, somebody who reads his own CC&Rs before he signs anything ought to be the one holding the checkbook. The board's annual election was in October. Debbie Voss's own term wasn't up until the following year, but 2 of the 5 seats were, including Marcus Burns, and under the association's bylaws, a recall petition could force an earlier vote if signed by at least 25% of the membership, 16 households. Roy's file already had 7. It took Delroy Watts and Arlene Petrosky, going door to door over 2 weekends with copies of the Herald article, exactly 11 days to get to 19, and a further week to reach 26 once the Whitfields started bringing their own neighbors along. Caleb's wheelchair ramp story, doing more to move quiet, uninvolved households than any spreadsheet ever could. The recall meeting was scheduled for the 3rd Saturday in November, in the clubhouse, 40 feet from a pool that had been drained and covered for the season. 58 of 61 lots were represented, in person or proxy, a number nobody had to strain to hit, because for the first time in the association's history, people actually wanted to come. Roy arrived early. He'd worn a collared shirt, brought a folder with Del Owens's survey, the banker's box invoices, and a printed copy of the county's letter confirming his agricultural exemption, and sat in the front row, not because he wanted to be seen, but because Nair had told him, flatly, "If this goes the way I think it will, you're going to want to be close enough to the podium to answer questions without shouting." Arlene sat on one side of him, Delroy on the other, and Gina Alcaraz stood near the back with a folder of her own, the internal email votes she'd printed before her resignation. Deborah Voss chaired the meeting, as was her right, until a recall vote said otherwise, and she opened it by reading a prepared statement defending the pool project as a legacy investment that has already increased every homeowner's property value, a claim she did not support with any documentation, and that Priscilla Ames, sitting in the back row with a notepad, wrote down word for word. When the floor opened for questions, Arlene Petrosky stood first. "Deborah," she said, her voice steadier than Roy expected, "can you confirm for everyone here whether the pool contract went to your husband's company at a higher price than 2 other bids the board had in hand?" Voss said the board had followed all appropriate procedures and that all bids were reviewed by the full board. Roy stood next and placed the invoices, the unrecused vote record, and the missing disclosure on the overhead projector he'd asked permission to bring. 268,000, 291,000, 340,000, he read aloud, tapping each number. The highest bid won. It happened to belong to the board president's husband, and there's no record in these minutes of her stepping outside the room for that vote. He said nothing at all for 11 full seconds, while 58 households read it for themselves. Gina Alcaraz stood after him and confirmed, without being asked twice, that the pool contract vote had in fact been conducted by email among 3 board members over a single evening, with no discussion recorded and no disclosure of the contractor relationship raised at any point she'd witnessed. Marcus Byrne, sitting beside Voss at the head table, said nothing at all. The recall vote, when it came near the end of a meeting that ran 3 hours longer than scheduled, removed both Marcus Byrne and, in a move the bylaws technically allowed, once a member introduced a motion to expand the recall to include any officer whose conduct was directly implicated in the matters under discussion, Deborah Voss herself, by a vote of 51-7. Colleen Ferraro resigned the following Monday, before anyone asked her to. Phil Ostrander, who had mostly nodded along for 2 years, resigned the same week, saying only that he hadn't understood how bad it had gotten until it was laid out like that. After everything Roy went through, was it worth it? Have you fought your HOA? Won or walked away? Tell me your story. The quiet title action never made it to trial. Facing a board that no longer had any interest in defending Debbie Voss's decisions, the association's new interim leadership, Arlene Petrosky, elected board president 2 weeks after the recall by a membership that had clearly had enough of surprises, with Delroy Watts and Gina Alcaraz joining her at the table, authorized a settlement in February. The pool's northeast corner, diving board included, would be removed and the deck reconfigured entirely within the association's legitimate boundary, at the association's expense, within 1 construction season. The 2003 easement amendment was formally rescinded as to Roy's parcel, and, on the new board's own motion, as to 2 other affected lots nobody had previously noticed were also encroached upon. Every fine Roy had paid under protest, $3,350 in total by the time the last one was issued, was refunded with statutory interest. The Whitfield's wheelchair ramp variance was approved unanimously at the new board's first meeting, backdated to the original application date, with a formal letter of apology Arlene insisted on including, even though Nair told her it wasn't legally required. Delroy Watts got his flagpole height reinstated, and, at his own request, a correction entered into the minutes, noting the original citation had never had a basis in the actual governing documents. And in a separate settlement, Deborah Voss's homeowner's insurance ultimately covered, rather than see the breach of fiduciary duty claim go before a jury with the Herald in the front row, Roy received $85,000 in damages for the year and a half his property had been encroached upon, litigated against, and fined into the ground. Deborah Voss and her husband sold their lake house the following spring and moved, according to Priscilla Ames's one follow-up item, to a lakefront property 2 counties over that, as far as anyone at Birchwood could determine, had no homeowners association at all. Roy still has the horses. He still has Gus the llama, who is by now something of a local celebrity thanks to a Facebook post that outlived the Herald article by several months. He rebuilt the composting operation back where his father originally kept it, 40 feet from the property line, because once the pool was gone and moved off his land, there was no diving board left to smell up anyway. And Roy, by his own account, has never been a man who holds a grudge longer than the situation requires. The lilac bushes his father planted are down to 4, but they've started sending up new shoots along the reconfigured boundary line, right where Del Owens's survey stakes used to sit. Roy leaves them alone. He figures, at this point, they've earned it. The Birchwood Lake Estates Homeowners Association still has a community pool. It's 11 feet, 3 inches smaller than it used to be, entirely on association land, and, according to the new board's first unanimous vote of the following spring, is now the only capital project in the community's history that required 3 competing bids, full board disclosure, and a signed conflict of interest form before a single shovel touched the ground. The new board also adopted, at Gina Alcaraz's insistence, a standing rule that no financial vote of more than $5,000 could be conducted by email alone, a rule Roy still thinks is the single most valuable thing to come out of the whole ordeal. That, Roy Kessler figures, might end up being worth more to Birchwood Lake Estates than the pool itself ever was. If your HOA has ever fined you for something that made absolutely no sense, or if you've got a story about a board that thought it could rewrite your property line without asking, drop it in the comments below. Subscribe for more real stories from the front lines of suburban America, because somewhere out there, right now, another board is drawing up plans they haven't run past a surveyor yet.